The town of Mesquite Flats still bore the bloodstains on the church steps 3 months after the Apache came. Not real blood. The summer rains had washed that away, but the kind that soaks into memory and won't fade. What nobody could explain, not the circuit judge who rode through in September, not the newspaper man from San Antonio who wrote it all down wrong, was why an outlaw with a price on his head walked into that church carrying a dying child, or why he stayed when he could have run. Some said it was madness, others claimed redemption, but those who were there, who saw what happened in the days that followed, they knew it was something else entirely, something that didn't fit the story anyone wanted to tell. And that was the problem. Because when the Apache surrounded Mesquite Flats in the summer of 1883, they weren't looking for justice or war. They were looking for one man. The question that still hung in the Texas heat like a ghost was simple. Had he saved that girl or stolen her? The spring of that year arrived late and mean across the borderlands. Dust devils danced through the single street of Mesquite Flats most afternoons, pulling grit through the cracks in every door and window. The town squatted between San Antonio and the wild country to the west, a place where people passed through more often than they stayed. It had a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, a general store run by a widow named Catherine Marsh, a blacksmith, a church that only saw a proper preacher twice a month, and a sheriff's office that had been empty since the previous lawman took a bullet over a card game and nobody wanted to replace him. The closest thing to law was a man named Harlan Cross, who wore a deputy's star from another county and spent most of his time drinking at the saloon or collecting debts for the land office in San Antonio. Cross was the kind of man who smiled when he spoke but never with his eyes, and he carried 2 pistols even though most men found one sufficient. He'd been in Mesquite Flats for 6 months, and in that time 3 drifters had left town suddenly in the night, though nobody asked why. Into this arrangement of dust and quiet desperation rode Thomas Garrett in early May, on a horse that had seen better days, and with a face that suggested the same. He was tall and lean in the way of men who'd spent more time hungry than fed, with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes that seemed to be looking at something farther away than whatever stood in front of him. He wore no gun on his hip, which was unusual enough to draw notice, but he carried a rifle in his saddle scabbard and moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned the cost of careless motion. He took a room above the saloon and paid for a week in advance with coins that were old but genuine. When the owner, a German named Klaus Berman, asked his business, Garrett said he was looking for work as a ranch hand or drover, that he'd worked cattle in Wyoming and Colorado and was heading south toward Mexico. It was a common enough story in that country, where men frequently moved in one direction or another depending on what they were running from. Berman gave him the key and asked no more questions. For the first few days, Garrett kept to himself. He took his meals alone, spoke little, and spent his mornings walking the perimeter of town as if measuring its dimensions. Catherine Marsh, who made it her business to know about everyone, noted that he bought supplies carefully, a little at a time, and that he never purchased whiskey or tobacco. He asked her once if there was a doctor in town, and when she said the nearest was in Uvalde, 2 days' ride east, he nodded and bought bandages and carbolic acid instead. On the 4th day, a freight wagon arrived from San Antonio with mail and supplies. The driver, a man named Jessup who made the route every 2 weeks, brought news along with the goods. There'd been Apache trouble to the west, he said. Not raids exactly, but sightings. A small band moving through the hills, maybe a dozen warriors. The army was tracking them but hadn't engaged. Jessup seemed more annoyed than afraid, said it would probably blow over like it always did, but that ranchers should keep their stock close and their rifles loaded just in case. Harlan Cross heard this news and made a show of checking his pistols in the street where everyone could see. He announced that any man who wanted to form a militia should speak with him, that he'd ridden with the Rangers before and knew how to handle Indian trouble. Half a dozen young men, the kind who'd never fired a shot in anger, gathered around him like he was preaching gospel. Catherine Marsh watched from her store window and felt something cold move through her chest. Though she couldn't have said why, Thomas Garrett also heard the news. He stood on the boarding house porch while Jessup talked, and Catherine noticed that his expression never changed, but his hands gripped the porch rail tight enough that his knuckles went white. That night, Garrett didn't come down for dinner. Klaus Berman knocked on his door around 8 and got no answer, and when he used his master key to check, the room was empty. Garrett's bedroll and rifle were gone. The money for the week's rent sat on the small table, along with an extra $1. Nobody saw which direction he'd ridden, and by morning most had forgotten about him entirely. Men came and went from Mesquite Flats like tumbleweeds. There was no reason to think this one mattered any more than the rest, but Catherine Marsh remembered the way he'd gripped that porch rail. And she wondered. 5 days passed. The heat settled in earnest, and the Apache trouble Jessup had mentioned seemed to evaporate like rain on hot stone. The militia Cross had tried to organize drifted back to their regular work. Life in Mesquite Flats returned to its usual rhythm of small transactions and smaller ambitions. Then, on a Tuesday morning just after dawn, Thomas Garrett returned. He came from the west, riding slowly, and in his arms he carried a child. Catherine was sweeping the boardwalk in front of her store when she saw him. The light was still gray and soft, and at first she thought she'd mistaken what she was seeing. But as he drew closer, there was no mistaking it. The child was a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wrapped in what looked like Garrett's own shirt. Her skin was dark, her hair black and matted with dust. She wasn't moving. Garrett's face was gray with exhaustion. His shirt was torn and stained with something dark, and there was a wound across his left forearm that had bled through a makeshift bandage. He didn't look left or right as he rode down the center of the street. He was heading directly for the church. Catherine dropped her broom and ran toward him, her skirts kicking up dust. By the time she reached the church steps, Garrett was dismounting, cradling the girl with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the hardness in his face. "Is she alive?" Catherine asked, and her voice sounded strange in her own ears. "Barely," Garrett said. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw. "She needs water, clean cloths, and someone who knows medicine." Catherine saw the girl's chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. There were scratches on her arms and face, and her feet were bare and bleeding. She wore what looked like traditional Apache clothing, a simple dress made of hide. Klaus Berman appeared from the saloon, still in his nightshirt. 2 other men came from their homes, drawn by the sound of voices. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, and Catherine watched their faces shift from curiosity to recognition to something harder. "That's an Apache child," one of the men said. His name was Porter, and he worked at the feed store. His voice carried an edge that made Catherine's stomach tighten. "She's hurt," Garrett said. He was climbing the church steps, moving as if the crowd didn't exist. "She needs help." "Where'd you find her?" Porter asked. He'd moved closer, and 2 other men moved with him. "In the hills," Garrett said. He'd reached the church door and was trying to open it while still holding the girl. Catherine moved quickly and opened it for him. "You steal her?" someone else asked. It was one of Cross's young militiamen, a boy named Eddie Holt whose father had been killed by Comanche 10 years prior. Garrett turned and looked at the boy. His eyes were bloodshot and exhausted, but there was something in them that made Eddie step back. "I found her dying of thirst in a ravine," Garrett said. There was no inflection in his voice. "If I hadn't brought her here, she'd be dead by now. Move aside." The crowd parted. Catherine followed Garrett into the church, and behind her she heard the murmur of voices growing louder, more agitated. Someone was asking where Harlan Cross was. Someone else was saying this was trouble, that Garrett had brought Apache trouble right into town. Inside the church, The air was cooler and smelled of old wood and candle wax. Garrett carried the girl to the front pew and laid her down as carefully as if she were made of glass. Catherine ran to the small room at the back where the visiting preacher kept his things and found a basin, some clean cloths, and a pitcher of water that was a day old but still good. When she returned, Garrett was kneeling beside the girl, speaking to her softly in a language Catherine didn't understand. The girl's eyes fluttered open briefly, dark and unfocused, then closed again. "You speak Apache," Catherine said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Some," Garrett said. He took the cloths from Catherine and began cleaning the girl's face with a tenderness that made Catherine's chest ache. He seemed to have forgotten she was there. He worked in silence, checking the girl's injuries, giving her small sips of water, wrapping her feet in strips of clean cloth. "What happened to her?" Catherine asked quietly. Garrett didn't answer immediately. He finished wrapping the girl's feet, then sat back on his heels. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. "I don't know the whole story," he said, "but she was alone. No tracks around her except her own. No sign of her people." "That doesn't make sense," Catherine said. "Apache don't abandon their children." "No," Garrett agreed, "they don't." The church door opened, and Harlan Cross walked in with 4 men behind him. Cross had his coat pulled back so his pistols were visible, and his smile was wide and cold. "Well now," Cross said. His voice echoed in the empty church. "This is quite the situation you've brought us, friend." Garrett stood slowly, positioning himself between Cross and the girl. Catherine saw his shoulders tense. "The child needs rest," Garrett said, "that's all." Cross walked down the center aisle, his boots loud on the wooden floor. The men with him spread out slightly, and Catherine realized with a sick feeling that they were flanking Garrett. "See, the problem is," Cross said, stopping about 10 feet away, "you brought an Apache into town. And just a few days back, we heard tell of Apache moving through the area. Now here you are, rode out of nowhere, came back with one of their young. That strikes me as peculiar." "I told your people," Garrett said. "I found her alone and dying." "Or you took her," Cross said. His smile never wavered. "Maybe you thought you could ransom her. Or maybe you're working with them, scouting for them." Catherine found her voice. "That's absurd," she said. "Look at him. He's hurt himself." Cross glanced at her as if noticing her for the first time. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I'd recommend you step outside. This is men's business." Catherine didn't move. The girl stirred on the pew, making a small sound. Garrett glanced back at her, and Cross's hand drifted toward his pistol. "You're going to tell me exactly where you found her," Cross said. "And you're going to tell me why I shouldn't put you in chains until we figure out what you're really doing here." Garrett looked at Cross for a long moment. Catherine could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of choices that all ended badly. She also saw something else, something that looked almost like resignation. "My name is Thomas Garrett," he said quietly. "I rode with the 3rd Cavalry out of Fort Grant in Arizona Territory from 78 to 81. I was a scout. I know Apache country and Apache language because that was my job. 3 years ago, I left the Army under circumstances that don't concern you. I've been working cattle since then, moving south. I came to this town for the same reason any man comes here, because it was on the way to somewhere else." He paused, and Catherine heard the weight of something unspoken in the silence. 2 days ago," he continued, "I rode west because I heard there was Apache in the hills and I wanted to avoid them. Instead, I found this girl. She'd been left in a place where no one would survive without water. There were no tracks but hers. Someone left her to die, Cross. And I don't know why." Cross tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Behind him, one of his men shifted nervously. "So you're a hero," Cross said. "That your story? I'm a man who found a dying child," Garrett said. "What I am doesn't change what she needs." Outside, the sound of voices was growing louder. Catherine could hear Porter and others arguing, could hear the word Apache repeated like a curse. The morning sun was rising higher, slanting through the church windows in pale gold columns, and in that light the girl on the pew looked impossibly small. Cross seemed to be considering something. His hand stayed near his pistol, but his smile had faded into something more thoughtful. "All right," he said finally, "she can stay here. You'll stay with her and you won't leave this church. I'll post men outside. When she's well enough to talk, we'll get the truth from her. And if I find out you're lying, Garrett, if I find out you're bringing trouble to this town, I'll hang you from the oak tree by the livery and let the crows have you." He turned and walked back up the aisle, his men following. At the door, he paused and looked back. "One more thing," he said. "If her people come looking for her, it's on you." Then he was gone, and the church was silent except for the girl's soft breathing. Catherine moved to the pew and sat down, her legs suddenly weak. Garrett remained standing, staring at the door. "You should have kept riding," Catherine said quietly. "You could be in Mexico by now." Garrett looked down at the girl, and something in his face broke open just for a moment, revealing a grief so deep Catherine had to look away. "I know," he said. Outside, the voices continued to rise, and somewhere in the distance, a dog began to bark in sharp, urgent bursts. Catherine stood and moved to the window. The street was filling with people now, more than she'd seen gather since the last Independence Day celebration. They were standing in clusters, talking, pointing at the church. She saw Porter arguing with Eddie Holt's mother. She saw Klaus Berman trying to calm a group of ranchers who'd ridden in from their spreads. And she saw, at the far end of the street, a plume of dust rising from the western road. At first she thought it was just wind, but the dust was moving in a deliberate line, coming closer, and as she watched, shapes began to emerge from it, horses, riders. "Garrett," she said, and her voice was tight. "Garrett, you need to see this." He came to the window and looked out. She watched his face go rigid. The riders were Apache. Even from a distance there was no mistaking them. They rode in a loose line, maybe 15 or 20 strong, and they were coming straight toward Mesquite Flats. They weren't riding fast, weren't charging, but there was something inexorable in their approach, like weather moving across the plain. The crowd in the street had seen them too. People were scattering, running for their homes. Catherine heard someone screaming. She heard the rapid crack of a door being barred, then another. Garrett turned from the window and looked down at the girl. She was sleeping now, her breathing a little steadier, her face peaceful despite everything. "They're here for her," Catherine whispered. "Aren't they?" Garrett nodded slowly. His hand moved to his side, to where a gun would have been if he'd worn one, then dropped uselessly to his side. "And they're going to want to know why she was dying alone in those hills," he said. "They're going to want to know who left her there." Catherine felt the pieces of something beginning to form in her mind, a picture she didn't yet understand but could sense taking shape. "Was it you?" she asked. "Did you take her from them?" Garrett met her eyes, and in his face she saw the answer before he spoke. "No," he said, "but I know who did." From outside came the sound of rifles being cocked, of Harlan Cross's voice shouting orders, of horses pulling to a stop in the street. The dog's barking had become frantic, then suddenly cut off. Catherine looked at Garrett, at the sleeping girl, at the church door that seemed far too thin to hold back what was coming. And in the terrible silence that followed, she heard the first Apache voice call out, demanding something she couldn't understand but felt in her bones. The Apache surrounded Mesquite Flats without firing a shot. They positioned themselves at every approach to the town, visible on the ridges and in the scrub, close enough that their numbers could be counted but far enough that a rifle shot would be wasted ammunition. They didn't attack. They didn't demand. They simply waited, and somehow that was worse than any violence could have been. Cross had barricaded the main street within an hour of their arrival. Wagons were overturned, barrels stacked, every piece of furniture that could stop a projectile dragged into position. Men who'd never held a rifle with purpose found themselves crouched behind these makeshift walls, squinting into the heat shimmer, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The Apache remained where they were, motionless as the stones around them, and the town held its collective breath. In the church, Garrett kept vigil over the girl. Catherine had stayed with him despite Cross's orders that all civilians should take shelter. She'd argued that the child needed tending, and Cross had been too busy organizing his defense to argue back. Now she sat in the front pew, dampening the girl's forehead with cool water, watching her sleep, and trying not to think about what would happen when she woke. The afternoon stretched into evening. The heat pressed down like a hand. Outside, she could hear Cross moving among his men, his voice carrying false confidence through the still air. Someone asked if they should try to negotiate, and Cross's response was sharp enough to carry through the church walls. They had nothing to negotiate with except the girl, and giving her back would be surrender. "That's not how it works," Garrett said quietly. He was standing at the window, watching the ridgeline. "They're not here to fight." Catherine looked up. "Then what do they want?" "Answers," Garrett said. He turned from the window and his face was drawn with exhaustion. "They want to know what happened to her, why she was left to die. Can she tell them? If she wakes, if she remembers, if she can speak about it without breaking apart." The girl stirred on the pew, making a small sound in her sleep. Catherine adjusted the cloth on her forehead and noticed that her breathing had deepened, become more regular. Whatever injuries she'd sustained, they weren't mortal. Given time and care, she would survive. Whether that survival would bring relief or greater tragedy remained to be seen. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit throughout the town. Catherine could see their glow through the church windows, small points of light that made the darkness between them seem deeper. The Apache had lit no fires. They remained invisible in the night, but their presence was palpable, a weight in the air that made breathing difficult. Cross came to the church near midnight. He entered without knocking, bringing 2 of his men with him. His face was flushed. Whether from heat or whiskey, Catherine couldn't tell. "She awake yet?" he asked, looking at the girl. "No," Garrett said. "Well, she needs to wake up," Cross said. "Because this standoff ends tomorrow one way or another, and I need to know what I'm dealing with." "She's a child," Catherine said, "not a bargaining chip." Cross turned his cold smile on her. "Miss Marsh, you're still here out of my generosity. Don't test it." "Your generosity," Garrett said, and there was something dangerous in his voice, "is going to get people hurt." "Better than getting them scalped," Cross said. He moved closer to the pew, looking down at the girl. "I've sent a rider to Fort McCavitt. Army should be here in 3 days if he makes good time. Until then, we hold." 3 days, Catherine said. "You expect those men out there to just wait for 3 days. What I expect," Cross said, "is that they'll get impatient and give me a reason to thin their numbers." He glanced at Garrett. "Unless your friend here wants to walk out there and explain things to them. You speak their language, right?" Garrett held Cross's gaze for a long moment. "Some of it," he said. "So go talk to them. Tell them the girl is safe, that we'll return her when we're satisfied she wasn't taken by force. Tell them to disperse, and if they don't believe me, then I guess we'll find out if they bleed the same as anyone else." Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You want this," she said. "You want to fight." Cross looked at her with something like pity. "What I want is to protect this town. If that requires force, then force is what I'll use." He turned back to Garrett. "You have until dawn to talk them down. Otherwise, we do this my way." After Cross left, the church fell silent again. Catherine could hear the girl's breathing, steady now, almost peaceful. She could hear Garrett moving to the window, could hear his hand on the frame, the wood creaking slightly under his grip. "I can't go out there," he said quietly. "If I do, they'll know." "Know what?" Catherine asked. He didn't answer immediately. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, and the sound seemed to hang in the air like a question. 3 years ago," Garrett said finally, "I was stationed at Fort Grant. I worked as a scout and translator. The Army was trying to broker peace with the Apache bands that hadn't surrendered yet, trying to convince them to come to the reservation. My job was to help with negotiations, to act as a bridge between languages and understandings. He paused, and Catherine waited. There was a man, Garrett continued, a lieutenant named Samuels, young, ambitious, convinced he knew better than everyone else. He decided that the way to force compliance was to take hostages, not adults they'd fight, but children. Take a few children from the camps, hold them at the fort, use them as leverage to bring their families in. Catherine's hand stilled on the cloth. "Oh God," she whispered. "I found out about it too late," Garrett said. "By the time I understood what was happening, Samuels had already taken 3 children. One of them was this girl's sister, her older sister. The silence in the church felt heavy enough to crush stone. I tried to stop it," Garrett said. "I reported Samuels to the colonel, argued that it would destroy any chance of peace. The colonel agreed with me, ordered the children returned. But before that could happen, something went wrong. There was confusion, maybe panic. The older girl tried to run. A soldier fired, she died." Catherine closed her eyes. "Samuels covered it up," Garrett said the girl had attacked him, that it was self-defense. The other children were returned to their families and the matter was considered closed. But I knew the truth. I testified against Samuels at a military hearing. They dismissed it, protected him. So I left the army and I've been moving ever since. "And the girl here?" Catherine asked quietly. "She's the sister of the girl who died," Garrett nodded. "Her name is Naitch. I don't know how she ended up alone in those hills, but I know why the Apache are here. They're not here for war. They're here because they think we took her, just like the army took her sister." Catherine looked down at the sleeping child, at her small face peaceful in rest, and felt her heart break a little. "Does she know who you are?" "I don't know," Garrett said. "I wasn't at the fort when her sister was taken. But she might remember me from the negotiations before." He turned from the window. "If I go out there, Catherine, and they recognize me, they'll assume I'm part of whatever happened to her this time. They'll assume I'm trying to finish what the army started. So what do we do?" "I don't know," Garrett said, and the defeat in his voice was absolute. The night passed slowly. Catherine dozed in the pew, waking periodically to check on Naitch, to give her water when she stirred. Garrett remained at the window, watching for movement that never came. Outside, the town was quiet except for the occasional murmur of voices from the barricades. Dawn came gray and cool, the kind of morning that promised heat later but began with mercy. Catherine woke to find Naitch's eyes open, looking up at her with an expression that was alert but unreadable. "You're safe," Catherine said softly, though she had no idea if the girl understood. "You're in a church, you're safe." Naitch's gaze moved past her to Garrett. Recognition flashed across her face, followed by something more complicated, fear, perhaps, or confusion. She said something in Apache, her voice weak but urgent. Garrett approached slowly, kneeling beside the pew. He responded in the same language, his pronunciation careful. The girl spoke again, longer this time, and Catherine watched Garrett's face change as he listened. "What's she saying?" Catherine asked. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then, "She says a man took her. A white man 3 days ago. She was gathering water near her camp when he grabbed her, put her on a horse. She tried to fight, but he hit her. He rode west with her for most of a day, then left her in a ravine. She doesn't know why." Catherine felt ice in her veins. "What man? Did she see his face?" Garrett asked, and Naitch answered. "His face went rigid. She describes him as having yellow hair," Garrett said, 2 guns, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The church door burst open. Cross stood in the entrance, backlit by the morning sun, and even from across the room Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders. "They're moving," he said, "all of them coming down from the ridges." Garrett stood. "How many all of them?" Cross repeated. "Maybe 30 now, more came during the night." He looked at Naitch, then at Garrett. "I need to know right now if that girl is worth dying for, because that's what this is about to become." Catherine found herself standing without deciding to. "She won't be a bargaining chip," she said. "Then she's a death sentence," Cross said flatly. "For everyone in this town. She's a witness," Garrett said quietly. "She knows who took her." Cross went very still. "What?" She can identify the man who abducted her, Garrett said, the man who left her to die. And when she does, this whole thing will make sense. Who was it? Cross asked. His voice was carefully controlled. Garrett looked at him steadily. She describes a man with yellow hair and 2 guns. A man who smiles without meaning it. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Catherine watched Cross's face, watched the calculations moving behind his eyes, watched him arrive at the same conclusion she just reached and decide how to respond. That could be anyone, Cross said. Could be, Garrett agreed. But you and I both know it isn't. Outside, voices were rising. Someone was shouting orders. Catherine heard the unmistakable sound of rifles being readied, of men preparing for violence they didn't understand. Cross's hand moved to his pistol, then stopped. His smile returned, but it was different now, tighter. You're making accusations you can't prove, he said. I'm stating what the girl told me, Garrett said. What you do with that information is your choice. The moment hung suspended, and Catherine realized she was holding her breath. Then Cross laughed, a short bark of sound without humor. You think they'll believe you, he said. You think anyone will? I think, Garrett said carefully, that if you walk out there and explain what happened, if you tell them you made a mistake, that you thought you were protecting the town from an Apache scout, but grabbed the wrong person, they might accept that. They might accept an apology and compensation. And if I don't, then people die, Garrett said, starting with you probably, but including everyone in this church and most of the men at those barricades, because those Apache aren't leaving without answers. Cross's face was unreadable. Catherine could see him weighing options, calculating odds. Finally, he shook his head. No, he said. Here's what's going to happen. That girl is confused, traumatized, doesn't remember things clearly. You found her wandering, probably separated from a raiding party. We keep her safe until the army arrives, then hand her over to proper authorities. End of story. That's not what happened, Catherine said. Cross looked at her like she was a particularly irritating insect. Miss Marsh, you're in way over your head. I'd suggest you keep quiet and let the men handle this. The church door opened again, and Klaus Berman entered, his face pale. They're at the barricades, he said. The Apache, they're not attacking, but they're. He struggled for words. They're waiting for something, someone to come out. Cross turned to Garrett. This is your mess, he said. You brought her here, so you're going to fix it. Go out there and tell them she's fine, that she'll be returned when it's safe. Use whatever words you need to. And if they don't accept that, if they start shooting, it's on you. I'm not lying to them, Garrett said. Then I guess we see how this plays out, Cross said. He drew one of his pistols and pointed it at Garrett. You have 2 choices. Walk out there and deliver my message, or I shoot you right here and tell everyone you were working with the Apache all along. Either way, I'm not the villain in this story. Catherine watched Garrett's face, watched him realize he had no good options, that every path forward led to violence. She saw the resignation in his eyes, the acceptance of consequences he'd been trying to avoid since he rode back into town. Then Nate spoke, her voice weak but clear. She said something in Apache, and though Catherine couldn't understand the words, she understood the tone. It was accusatory, certain. The voice of someone naming truth. Cross's face went white. Shut her up, he said. But Nate kept speaking, her voice growing stronger. She was looking directly at Cross now, pointing at him with one small finger, and the words came faster, more urgent. What's she saying? Cross demanded. Garrett, what's she saying? Garrett's expression was grim. She's saying you came to her camp, that you watched them for days. That you took her when she was alone because you wanted to draw her people out, to start a war. She's saying you're the killer of children. That's insane, Cross said, but his voice had lost its steadiness. She's making that up. Is she? Garrett asked, because it would make sense. The army's been trying to clear the Apache from this region for years. A massacre, especially if it could be framed as retaliation, would justify a major campaign. Good for business if you're collecting fees from the land office. Good for your reputation if you're the man who finally brings peace to the borderlands. Cross raised his pistol. You don't know what you're talking about. Then prove it, Catherine said. She was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Walk out there unarmed and tell them the truth. If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. For a moment, Catherine thought Cross might shoot them all right there. His finger was on the trigger, his face twisted with something between rage and panic. Then Klaus spoke from the doorway. Harlan, he said quietly. His accent made the name sound almost gentle. I think maybe you should go. There are too many witnesses now. Cross looked around the church, at Klaus, at Catherine, at Garrett, at the small Apache girl who'd somehow brought his carefully constructed world crashing down. He lowered the pistol slowly. This isn't over, he said. Then he turned and walked out. The silence he left behind felt fragile, like glass. Catherine moved to the window and watched Cross emerge from the church, watched him walk toward the barricades where his men waited. She saw him stop at the first barrier, saw him speaking to someone, gesturing back toward the church. Then she saw him turn and run. He ran toward the stable at the edge of town, moving fast, and Catherine understood a moment before it happened that he was going to try to escape. She saw one of his militia men raise a rifle, confused. She saw Cross draw his pistol and fire, and the militia man went down. Then the Apache moved. They didn't charge. They simply closed in, moving down from their positions with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of warriors who'd fought together for years. Cross made it to the stable, made it onto a horse, and rode hard for the eastern road. 3 Apache riders pursued him, but they didn't need to hurry. They knew the country, knew every trail and water source, and Cross was riding blind into territory he'd never bothered to learn. By the time the sun was fully up, Cross was gone, and the town of Mesquite Flats was surrounded by Apache who made no move to attack. Instead, one rider approached alone, his hands visible and empty. He stopped at the barricades and called out in accented English. "We want to speak to the man who brought our daughter back," he said. "We want to speak to Thomas Garrett." Garrett walked out to meet him. Catherine watched from the church window, her heart in her throat, as the 2 men faced each other in the dusty street. She couldn't hear what they said, but she saw Garrett gesture back toward the church, saw the Apache warrior nod. Then slowly, the rest of the Apache began to withdraw, moving back toward the ridges and then beyond, disappearing into the country they knew like breath. By noon, they were gone entirely. Nate stayed in the church for another week, recovering under Catherine's care. Her people came for her on a Tuesday morning, riding in openly this time, and the reunion between the girl and her family was something Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. There were tears and embraces and words spoken too quickly for translation, and through it all Nate kept looking back at Garrett with an expression of gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that suggested she understood what he'd risked. They asked Garrett to come with them, to live among them as a friend of the people. He declined gently, saying he needed to keep moving, that standing still had never been his nature. They accepted this with the kind of grace that spoke of understanding, and they left him gifts, a blanket, a knife with a bone handle, and a promise that he would always be welcome in their camps. Cross was never found. Search parties rode out for weeks, scouring the hills and canyons, but the land had swallowed him completely. Some said the Apache caught him and delivered justice in their own way. Others claimed he made it to Mexico and started over under a new name. Catherine thought he probably died of thirst in some nameless ravine, alone and unmourned, but she kept that opinion to herself. The town of Mesquite Flats changed after that summer. The bloodstains on the church steps became a reminder not of violence, but of the moment when truth had mattered more than comfort. New people came, drawn by stories of the place where a standoff had been resolved without massacre. Catherine married Klaus Berman the following spring, and they ran the general store together for 30 years. Garrett stayed through the fall, helping with the harvest, But when winter came, he rode south as he'd always planned. Catherine never saw him again. But she thought of him often, especially on hot summer evenings when dust devils danced through the street and the past felt close enough to touch. She thought of the choices he'd made, the costs he'd paid, and the child he'd saved despite knowing it would cost him everything. And sometimes, late at night, she wondered what would have happened if he'd kept riding that first time. If he'd never looked down into that ravine, never seen Nate dying in the heat, never made the decision that changed everything. Would Cross's plan have worked? Would there have been a massacre? Would the town have survived? There were no answers to these questions. The past was fixed, unchangeable, and all she could do was remember. The years passed. Catherine grew older, her dark hair turning silver, her hands developing the stiffness of age. Klaus died in 1901, peacefully in his sleep, and she ran the store alone after that. The town around her changed too, growing larger, adding buildings and streets, becoming something more than just a place where people passed through. The church remained, though a new one was built beside it, grander and more modern. The old church became a school, then a storage building, then finally just a piece of history that most people walked past without noticing. In 1923, when Catherine was 72 years old and thinking more about past than future, a stranger came to her store. He was young, maybe 30, with dark hair and eyes that reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. He introduced himself as Daniel Garrett, said he was researching his family history, and asked if she'd ever known a man named Thomas Garrett who'd passed through around 1883. Catherine felt 40 years fold away like paper. She invited him to sit, poured coffee, and told him everything she remembered. She spoke for hours, and he listened with the kind of attention that suggested he'd been searching for these stories his entire life. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He was my grandfather," Daniel said finally. "He died in 1905 in Colorado. I never knew him well, but my father told me he'd been involved in something important in Texas, something that changed his life. I've been trying to understand what that was." Catherine stood and walked to the back of the store, to a box she kept on a high shelf. She pulled it down and opened it, revealing the contents she'd kept for 40 years. A letter from Garrett, never sent, explaining what had happened in more detail than he'd ever spoken aloud. A newspaper clipping about Cross's disappearance, and a small bracelet made of beads and leather, left behind by Nate and given to Catherine as a gift. She handed the letter to Daniel. "This belongs to your family," she said. He wanted someone to know the truth. Daniel read in silence, and Catherine watched his face change as understanding dawned. When he finished, he looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "He saved her," Daniel said. "Even though it cost him everything, he saved her." "Yes," Catherine said, "he did." Daniel left the next day, promising to return and share what he'd learned. Catherine never saw him again, but she heard later that he'd written a book about his grandfather, about the summer of 1883, and the choice one man made in the face of impossible odds. The book caused a small stir in academic circles, prompted some discussions about the Apache Wars and the complexities of that time, then faded into the background noise of history. But for Catherine, reading a copy in the last year of her life, it was enough. The truth had been told. The story had been preserved. And Thomas Garrett, who'd lived so much of his life in the shadows, had finally been brought into the light. She died in 1927, peacefully, surrounded by the memories of a town that had long since outgrown its violent beginnings. The old church was torn down in 1935 to make room for a new courthouse. The general store became a cafe, then a law office, then was demolished in the 1950s. The physical spaces of that summer disappeared, reclaimed by progress and time, but the story remained. It was passed down through families, whispered in schools, occasionally referenced in local histories. Each telling changed it slightly, added details or removed them, turned it into legend. Some versions made Garrett a hero, others a villain. Some claimed the Apache had massacred the town, others that no Apache had ever been there at all. The truth became malleable, shaped by the needs and fears of each new generation that told it. Until 1984, when a graduate student named Sarah Chen was researching frontier justice for her dissertation. She was working in the archives of a San Antonio library when she found a box of letters from the old land office, correspondence that had never been cataloged or reviewed. Buried among routine business transactions was a letter from Harlan Cross to his superior, dated May 1883, outlining his plan to provoke an Apache attack that would justify military action and open up new territories for settlement. The letter was clinical in its cruelty, methodical in its madness. Cross had written it as a proposal, seeking approval and compensation. There was no indication whether he'd ever received a response, but the letter's existence proved that his actions hadn't been spontaneous. They'd been calculated, planned, and motivated by profit. Sarah brought the letter to her advisor, who brought it to a historian who specialized in the Apache Wars, who brought it to a journalist who'd grown up hearing stories about Mesquite Flats. The letter was authenticated, published, and suddenly the story was real again, grounded in documentary evidence that couldn't be dismissed as legend. News crews came to what remained of Mesquite Flats, now a quiet suburb absorbed by a larger city. They interviewed descendants of the original settlers, searched for graves, tried to piece together what had actually happened that summer. They found Catherine's grave and Klaus's beside it. They found records of Thomas Garrett's military service, his testimony against Lieutenant Samuels, his resignation from the army. They found, in a museum in Colorado, the bracelet Catherine had kept, donated after her death by a distant relative who'd had no idea of its significance. But they never found Cross. Despite renewed efforts, despite modern technology and resources the original searchers could never have imagined, Harlan Cross remained a ghost. The frontier had kept him, and it refused to give him back. The story became a book, then a documentary, then the subject of academic papers and conferences. People argued about Garrett's motivations, about whether he'd been a hero or simply someone trying to atone for past failures. They debated the Apache perspective, tried to identify Nate and learn what had become of her. Some claimed to have found evidence that she'd lived into old age, that she'd told her own version of the story to her grandchildren. Others suggested the whole thing had been exaggerated, that the truth was simpler and less dramatic. But the letter remained, physical proof that at least some of the story was true, that a man had tried to start a war for profit, and that somehow, against all odds, he'd been stopped. In 2015, a filmmaker named Marcus Webb traveled to what had been Mesquite Flats to make a documentary about frontier violence. He'd read Sarah Chen's research, studied the available records, and become convinced that there was more to find. He spent weeks in the area talking to locals, searching through old buildings slated for demolition, following leads that mostly went nowhere. Then, in the basement of what had once been the town's second church, he found a journal. It was wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath a floorboard, preserved by accident and luck. The journal belonged to Catherine Marsh, and it contained daily entries from 1883 to 1885, including a detailed account of everything that had happened that summer. Marcus read the journal in one sitting, unable to stop. Catherine's voice came through clearly across more than a century, practical and observant and deeply compassionate. She'd written about Garrett's arrival, about Nate's rescue, about the standoff and Cross's flight. But she'd also written about the aftermath, about the weeks and months that followed, filling in details that no official record had captured. And in one entry, dated November 1883, she'd written something that changed everything Marcus thought he knew. Thomas Garrett returned today, she wrote. He came to tell me he'd found Cross. Not the body, just evidence of where he'd been, a camp in the hills, abandoned for months. And in that camp, Thomas found something that explained everything. A second letter, written but never sent, in which Cross admitted he'd been working with Samuels, that the plan to take Apache children had been theirs together, that Nature's sister's death hadn't been an accident. They'd killed her as a test, to see if they could provoke a war. When that failed, Cross tried again in Mesquite Flats. Marcus stopped reading and sat back, his mind racing. If this was true, if Cross and Samuels had been collaborating, then the entire narrative of the Apache wars in that region needed to be reconsidered. It meant that at least some of the violence, some of the atrocities that had been blamed on both sides, might have been deliberately provoked by men seeking profit and advancement. He brought the journal to historians, to experts who could authenticate it. They confirmed that the handwriting matched other documents by Catherine Marsh, that the paper and ink were period appropriate, that there was no evidence of forgery. The journal was real, which meant its contents demanded attention. A new investigation began, this time with resources and technologies that would have seemed like magic to the original players in this drama. Researchers used ground-penetrating radar to search the hills west of what had been Mesquite Flats. They found old camps, artifacts, evidence of long-ago human presence. And in one canyon that matched Catherine's description, they found remains. Human remains, along with scraps of leather and metal that suggested someone had died there, alone, more than a century ago. The remains were too degraded for visual identification, but DNA analysis was possible. Descendants of Cross's family were located, samples were taken, and months later the results came back. The remains belonged to Harlan Cross. He died in that canyon, probably of thirst or exposure, and the frontier had kept his body for more than 130 years. Near the remains, researchers found something else, a leather satchel, remarkably preserved by the dry climate. Inside was the letter Catherine had mentioned, along with other documents that told the story of a conspiracy that had cost lives and almost started a war. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and it forced a reckoning with history. The story of Thomas Garrett and Nate was retold with new understanding. Museums created exhibits. Universities offered courses examining the manipulation of frontier conflicts. Descendants of the Apache families involved were consulted, their perspectives finally given the weight they deserved. And gradually, a more complete picture emerged of that summer in 1883, of the people involved and the choices they'd made. Garrett was recognized for what he'd been. Not a perfect hero, but a flawed man who tried to do right despite the cost. Nate was remembered not as a victim but as a survivor, a witness whose testimony had exposed a dangerous truth. And Catherine Marsh, whose quiet documentation had preserved the story for future generations, was honored as the kind of historian every age needs but rarely recognizes. But perhaps most importantly, the story became a reminder that truth matters, that individual choices can change the course of history, and that the past is never quite as simple as the stories we tell about it. The frontier had been a place of violence and injustice, yes, but also of courage and compassion, of people who chose to stand against cruelty even when it would have been easier to look away. And in a world that still struggled with those same choices, that still faced the temptation to provoke conflict for profit, the lesson seemed worth remembering. The investigation continues, even now. New evidence surfaces periodically, new perspectives are offered, and the story evolves with each discovery. But the core of it remains unchanged. One summer, in a small town that no longer exists, people made choices that echoed across more than a century. Some of those choices were evil. Some were heroic. Most were simply human, complicated and imperfect and real. And somewhere in the balance between those extremes lies the truth we're still trying to understand. \n, the letter Marcus Webb found wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of understanding how many endings there had been, scattered across time like seeds carried by wind, each one taking root in different soil. When the DNA results came back confirming that the remains in the canyon belonged to Harlan Cross, the researchers returned to the site one final time. They mapped every detail, documented every artifact, trying to reconstruct his final days. What they found suggested he'd survived alone for perhaps 2 weeks after fleeing Mesquite Flats, living on rainwater trapped in stone depressions, and whatever small game he could catch. The satchel containing his letters had been carefully placed beneath an overhang, protected from the elements, as if he'd known in the end that the truth would matter more than his survival. Among the documents was something no one expected, a confession, written in Cross's own hand during those final days. The handwriting deteriorated as the pages progressed, becoming shaky and erratic, but the words were clear enough. He described his arrangement with Lieutenant Samuels, the plan to provoke Apache attacks that would justify military expansion. He explained how the death of Nate's sister had been calculated, how taking Nate herself had been a second attempt when the first hadn't produced the desired results. He wrote about his certainty that he'd be remembered as a hero, that history would vindicate men who pushed civilization westward by any means necessary. And then, in the final pages, something shifted. The tone changed. Cross wrote about the faces of his militia men as he'd fled, the confusion and betrayal in their eyes. He wrote about thirst, about heat, about the land itself seeming to reject him. He wrote about seeing riders on distant ridges who might have been Apache or might have been his own guilt taking shape in the shimmer. And in the last legible entry, he wrote something that Marcus would never forget. I thought I was building something. Turns out I was just another man dying alone in the dirt, and the land doesn't care about the difference. When these documents were published, they sparked conversations that reached far beyond academic circles. Families who'd lived in what had been Mesquite Flats for generations found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about their town's founding. The narrative many had grown up with, of brave settlers defending themselves against savage attacks, became more complicated. Not false exactly, but incomplete. The violence had been real, but so had the manipulation behind it. Among those most affected was a woman named Helen Porter, great-granddaughter of the man who challenged Garrett in the church that morning. She'd grown up hearing her family's version of events, in which her ancestor had been a concerned citizen trying to protect his community. Now, reading Catherine's journal and Cross's confession, she had to reconcile those stories with evidence that complicated them. She spent months researching, talking to other descendants, trying to understand what her great-grandfather had actually known and believed. Eventually, she reached out to Marcus. They met in a cafe in what had been Mesquite Flats, now just another street corner in a sprawling city. She brought old photographs, letters her great-grandfather had written in the years after that summer. In those letters, Helen said, he'd expressed doubts about Cross, had written to his brother about feeling manipulated, about wondering if they'd been protecting the town or serving someone else's agenda. I think he knew, Helen said quietly, maybe not everything, but enough to feel compromised. He stayed in Mesquite Flats for another 30 years, but according to family stories, he never talked about that summer, just refused to discuss it. Marcus nodded. That's common in the other accounts too. People who were there who took up rifles at the barricades, most of them stayed silent about it afterward, like they were trying to forget, or trying not to examine it too closely, Helen said, because if they did, they'd have to admit they'd been used. That they'd almost participated in something monstrous. The conversation turned to Garrett, to what had become of him after he left Mesquite Flats. Marcus had traced his movements through Colorado, following military pension records and land claims. Garrett had settled near a small town, worked as a ranch hand, lived quietly. According to census records, he'd never married, never owned property, never did anything to draw attention. He died in 1905, and his obituary in the local paper was 3 sentences long, noting only his name, his work, and the fact that he'd served in the cavalry. But there was more to it than that. Marcus had found letters Garrett had written to Catherine Marsh, sent periodically over 2 decades. She'd kept every one, and they'd been preserved with her journal. In those letters, Garrett had written about his life, his work, his thoughts on the world. He'd written about nightmares that never quite faded, about seeing Nature's face every time he closed his eyes. He'd written about wondering if saving one child could balance the scales for all the things he'd failed to prevent during his time as an Army scout. In one letter, dated 1891, he'd written something that Marcus kept returning to. I used to think there were clear lines between right and wrong, that a man just had to choose which side he was on. Now I think maybe we're all standing in the middle, trying to step toward the light, and the best we can hope for is that we move more in that direction than the other. I saved Nate. I'll die knowing that. But I'll also die knowing about all the children I didn't save, couldn't save, didn't even know needed saving. So what does that make me? Catherine had responded, and her response was preserved too. It makes you human, Thomas. It makes you someone who tried. That's not nothing. The documentary Marcus eventually produced focused less on the dramatic standoff than on these quieter moments, these letters and reflections that revealed the lasting cost of those few days in 1883. He interviewed descendants, historians, and members of Apache communities whose ancestors had lived through that era. He talked about systemic violence, about how individual cruelty could be magnified by institutional support, about the long process of confronting difficult histories. The most powerful interview was with an elder from a community whose ancestors might have known Nature's family. The man, who asked not to be named, spoke about oral histories that had been passed down, stories about a girl who'd been taken and returned, about a white man who'd stood against his own people to protect her. The details didn't match perfectly with the documentary record, had been changed by time and retelling, but the emotional core was the same. She lived a long life, the elder said, had children and grandchildren. Taught them to be wary but not hateful, to judge people by their actions rather than their words. She spoke about the man who carried her back, said he had sad eyes and gentle hands. Said she'd been afraid at first, thought he was part of what had happened, but then he spoke her language and called her by her name, and she understood he was different. Did she ever see him again? Marcus asked. The elder shook his head no, but she remembered. That's what we do, we remember. When the documentary aired, it reached a wider audience than Marcus had anticipated. Schools began using it in history classes. Discussion groups formed. Some viewers were defensive, uncomfortable with challenging familiar narratives. Others were grateful, said it helped them understand pieces of family history that had never made sense. And a few, a surprising number, came forward with their own stories of frontier violence, of crimes committed and buried, of truths their families had kept quiet for generations. Among those who reached out was a man named James Samuels, great-great-grandson of the Lieutenant Garrett had testified against. James had been researching his ancestor for years, trying to understand why the family had always been vague about his military service. After seeing the documentary, pieces fell into place. He found records of the hearing Garrett had testified at, found evidence that his ancestor had been quietly transferred after the incident, promoted despite the accusations. The pattern suggested a cover-up, protection of an officer who'd been useful to certain interests. James wrote to Marcus, including everything he'd found. I spent years thinking my family was hiding some noble secret, he wrote. Turns out we were just hiding shame. I don't know what to do with this information, but I wanted you to have it. Maybe someone can use it to understand what actually happened. Marcus added James's research to an archive he was building, a collection of documents and testimonies related not just to the Mesquite Flats incident, but to the broader pattern of frontier violence it represented. The archive grew to include hundreds of items, each one a piece of a larger picture that was still emerging. Universities began citing it. Journalists used it for investigations into other historical events. Slowly, it became a resource for people trying to understand a complex and often brutal period of history. But Marcus kept returning to Catherine's journal, to her quiet observations about the aftermath. She'd written about how the town had changed in the months and years after the Apache left. People had become more careful with each other, more aware that their actions could have consequences beyond what they intended. The militia cross had tried to form, never reorganized. When conflicts arose with Apache or other tribes, townspeople sought mediation before confrontation. It wasn't perfect, Catherine had written, but it was different. Like we'd all looked into something dark and decided we didn't want to see it again. She'd also written about receiving news of Cross's disappearance, about the search parties that had returned empty-handed. There was satisfaction in some faces, she'd noted, relief in others. A few people seemed troubled by it, said even a man like Cross deserved a proper trial and burial, but most were content to let the desert keep him. Maybe that's justice in its own way. Not the kind we choose, but the kind the land provides. Years later, Catherine had attended Thomas Garrett's funeral in Colorado. She'd made the journey despite her age, had stood among strangers while they buried a man she'd known for only a few months but had corresponded with for decades. In her journal entry about that day, she'd written, "They said nice things about him, the people from his town, that he was reliable, quiet, kept to himself but helped when asked. They didn't know what I knew about the child he'd saved and the cost he'd paid for doing what was right. I wanted to tell them to make sure someone said aloud what he'd done. But then I thought maybe he wouldn't want that. Maybe he'd spent all those years trying not to be known for one moment, trying to just be a person living a life. So I kept quiet. But I remembered. God knows I remembered." The archive Marcus built, the documentary he produced, the conversations they sparked, all of it was ultimately an act of remembering. An attempt to ensure that the complexity of what had happened, the shades of gray that existed between heroism and villainy, weren't simplified into comfortable narratives. People needed to know that Cross had been protected by systems that valued expansion over justice. They needed to know that Garrett had been failed by those same systems when he tried to work within them. They needed to know that Catherine and others like her had borne witness, had documented and remembered when forgetting would have been easier. The physical places were mostly gone. The church where Nate had been sheltered was demolished decades ago. The canyon where Cross had died was now part of a nature preserve, unmarked except for a small plaque installed after the remains were found. The plaque said only, "Site of historical significance related to frontier settlement patterns, 1,883 no names, no details, just an acknowledgement that something had happened there." But the story persisted. It lived in archives and documentaries, in academic papers and family histories. It lived in conversations about justice and mercy, about the courage required to stand against your own community, about the long shadows cast by individual choices. It became one of many stories people told when trying to understand how violence happens, how it can be prevented, how we learn to be better than we've been. On a spring evening in 2019, a group of descendants gathered at the site of what had been Mesquite Flats. They came from different families, different backgrounds, different relationships to the story. Helen Porter was there, along with James Samuels. Representatives from Apache communities came, along with historians and filmmakers, and simply curious people who'd been moved by the story and wanted to stand where it had happened. They didn't hold a ceremony exactly. There were no speeches or formal acknowledgments. Instead, people walked the area, tried to imagine what it had looked like in 1883, shared what they knew and what they wondered about. Someone brought a copy of Catherine's journal and read passages aloud. Someone else sang in Apache, a traditional song about journeys and homecoming. As the sun set, turning the sky purple and gold, the group stood together in silence, each person alone with their thoughts but part of something larger. Marcus stood slightly apart, watching. He'd spent years with this story, had traced every thread he could find, had built an archive and produced a documentary and given countless talks about what had happened and what it meant. But standing there, in the place where it had all unfolded, he felt the limits of what could be known. So much had been lost to time, so many perspectives would never be recovered. The full truth of what had happened that summer was beyond anyone's ability to reconstruct. But maybe, he thought, that was the point. Maybe the value wasn't in knowing everything with certainty, but in asking the questions, in refusing to accept simple answers, in honoring the complexity of human beings trying to do right in impossible situations. Maybe the legacy of Thomas Garrett and Nate and Catherine Marsh wasn't about heroes and villains, but about the ongoing work of trying to understand each other across divides of culture and time and perspective. The evening deepened. Stars emerged in the darkening sky, the same stars that had looked down on Mesquite Flats in 1883, indifferent and eternal. The group began to disperse, people saying quiet goodbyes, promising to stay in touch, to continue the conversations they'd started. Marcus was among the last to leave, standing in the gathering dark, trying to hold the moment a little longer. Before he got in his car, he looked back one final time at the empty land. The city lights were visible in the distance, but here it was still possible to imagine the frontier as it had been, vast and unforgiving and full of people trying to survive, and sometimes, occasionally, trying to do better than just survive. The desert kept its secrets, but it also kept its stories, and as long as people were willing to listen, to dig through archives and talk to descendants and sit with uncomfortable truths, those stories would continue to matter. Not because they provided easy answers, but because they reminded us that the questions we're asking now aren't new, that people have always struggled with justice and mercy, and the distance between who we are and who we want to be. Marcus drove back toward the city, carrying with him the weight of everything he'd learned. Tomorrow there would be more research, more interviews, more pieces to add to the archive. But tonight he let himself simply sit with the story, with its gaps and contradictions, with the lives it had touched across more than a century. The truth was incomplete. The justice was imperfect. But the remembering, the witnessing, the refusal to let it all disappear into convenient forgetting, that was something. Maybe it was enough. Behind him, the desert settled into night, patient and vast, holding its memories in stone and silence, waiting for the next person who would come looking for answers and learn instead to live with questions. The frontier was gone, but its lessons remained, written in dust and blood and the stubborn hope of people who believed, despite everything, that truth mattered and kindness counted and one life saved was worth whatever it cost. The camera pulls back. The stars wheel overhead. And the story, like all stories that matter, refuses to end.